Mr. Chomsky, I hope that our TV interview will give an insight into your perception of the world, that it will clarify your basic values, but also why you still believe in them, although the political and economic practice tells a different story. You believe in the rational capacities of each human being more than any intellectual or philosopher I do know. You want to give a voice to the millions of people who suffer, and you analyze in a clear, empirical way how the power system operates. Every reader of your books, and I mention only this one, must get a feeling of disgust, if not about the system, then about himself, not about himself, about you, who dares to describe the working of so many crimes, so-called in the name of democracy. And recently I found here another voice in the Financial Times of last weekend, Edward Luce, writing, when you look at how democracy functions in America nowadays, we should feel embarrassed to recommend it to anyone. That's why my first question to you is about the American Constitution of 1776 and the Bill of Rights. Till what extent do your values coincide with those in the Constitution and Bill of Rights?
Well, for one thing, almost nobody's values these days, I hope, coincide with everything in the Constitution. So, for example, one provision in the Constitution is that blacks are 3/5 human. And that was put in to ensure that the slave-holding states would sign and, in fact, have extra power because they would get extra voting rights from the 3/5 humans that they had. I hope you won't find many people who hold those values. There are other values which I think did express decent positions growing out of the Enlightenment. Bill of Rights was added on because of popular opposition to the Constitution and popular demands that basic rights be preserved in ways that they were not in the Constitution itself. But it's a mixed story. The Constitution has, of course, changed over the years through amendment, through law, through practice. Furthermore, the Constitution itself was not really intended as at least what I would call a democratic document. James Madison explained what he intended the Constitution to be. It was its one primary goal, in his words, was to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. That's the so-called danger of the tyranny of the majority, otherwise known as democracy. And you have to protect the minority, the opulent against the majority. It's interesting that Madison was concerned with essentially the same problem that concerned Aristotle in the first major book on politics, Aristotle's Politics. They were both concerned, both of them regarded democracy as the more preferable of the various types of systems. Neither was wildly in love with it, but it was the best. But they both noted a problem with democracy. Namely, if you have a democracy under conditions of significant inequality, then the majority will use their voting rights to take away the property of the rich, and that's a problem. Yeah. So they both noticed it, and they both had a solution, but opposite solutions. For Aristotle, the solution was to reduce inequality by measures which are approximately what we would call welfare state measures. For Madison, the solution was to reduce democracy. So, as he put it, power should be in the hands of the wealth of the nation, of people who sympathize with property and its rights. And the more democratic part of the constitutional system, the House of Representatives, was given the least power. The Senate, the wealth of the nation, was to have more power. And the system was designed in general to fragment, in fact, the population so that the wealth of the nation would be able to dominate.
How do you view the criticisms, especially from the Sun Arab intellectuals, that they say, well, all that talking about universal values is a Western invention?
No, I don't think so. Let's take the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the best codification we have of an attempt to develop universal values. That was not a Western invention. If you look at the participation in the codification of the Universal Declaration, it was from all over the world. Much of it from what we now call the Third World. And there's things wrong with it. I don't think it's a perfect document, but I think it expresses quite reasonable values. I wish the countries of the world would even dream of living up to them.
Yeah.
So, for example, take the United States, most important country. The Universal Declaration has essentially three components. First is civil and political rights. The second is social and economic rights. The third is cultural rights. The cultural rights one is mostly disregarded. The United States has officially declared the second part, social and economic rights, to be invalid. It's called, Gene Kirkpatrick once called it a letter to Santa Claus. Morris Abrams, the delegate to the ambassador to the UN Commission on Human Rights, just called it preposterous, a dangerous assumption. Paula Dobriansky is now in the government and was also in the Reagan administration, simply described it as a myth that social and economic rights exist. They don't exist. I mean, they're in the Universal Declaration. They have the same status as all other rights, but the most important country in the world, the so-called leader of the free world, simply declares them inoperative.
But, you know, we are hitting here an interesting point, namely the Golden Rule says, as we all more or less know, that you should treat the other persons as you want to be treated. But now the paradox arises that a man is a wolf to a man, and that from an empirical historical point of view, he has more right than you, what the normal state of affairs is concerned.
From an empirical point of view, if you look at history, women are not human. They're serfs of some sort. You take a look at most of human history, it's been true. I mean, there are exceptions. There are matriarchal societies and so on, but by and large, it's true. If you say try to make a generalization that women shouldn't have rights, they should be the servants or the slaves of the men in the patriarchal societies. So what? That just tells us there's something wrong with the way human history is developed, and we should therefore improve it. Therefore, we should struggle for women's rights. And in fact, only in our own lifetimes, there's been very significant improvement in that respect. I mean, what's happened because there's a constant striving, and it comes from our inner nature towards overcoming elements of historical practice that at some level we understand to be intolerable. And in fact, it's quite interesting to look at the discussions and debates over these issues.
Another question, which is, so to say, in the heart of your whole way of thinking and action, is that you consider every power or authority inherently illegitimate unless it is explicitly justified. And I must say, I do too. And yet, also here we have the question that people accept so easily all kinds of belief systems and hierarchies, both the religious ones as well as the secularist ones.
Well, I don't look at either contemporary society or history that way. In fact, I think over time, let's just take the last few centuries or even the last few years, there's an expansion of the moral horizon. Things that were considered entirely legitimate, proper, or even noble, are now considered criminal and unspeakable. As we extend, and I think we can regard that as a kind of a slow recognition of our true moral natures as we struggle out of a history of oppression, subordination, and so on. I've mentioned a couple of examples and can easily add others. Take, say, animal rights. I mean, the moral horizon is, in recent years, extending to the point where we at least consider that animals do have rights. Right here in Cambridge, for example, where we're talking, not many years ago, there were very few constraints on animal experimentation. Now there are significant constraints. There's debate about just what they should be. You can have, it's not a settled issue, but the point is it is a question. Not long ago it wasn't a question. Slavery is now considered totally illegitimate. Not that it doesn't exist. There may be 30 million slaves in the world, but it's considered to be something entirely wrong. That's very recent in human history. Same with rights of women, same with the rights of minorities, the same even with means of warfare. I mean, it's totally barbarous, but things that were regarded as legitimate no longer are. I mean, the Supreme Court right now is considering the question of whether what's called enhanced interrogation, which is another word for torture, is a legitimate practice. Not long ago that was not considered a question. But this happens all through history. And there's example after example of it. So it seems to me you can find plenty of horrifying practices, but you can also detect a tendency, not a uniform tendency, but a significant tendency towards recognizing principles of justice and humanity and morality, which are part of our nature, and a recognition that we should do something to bring them to implementation and fruition. That does seem to me a definite historical tendency, and it tells us something about human nature.
Mr. Chomsky, as a young boy, you believed in Zionism, and your belief in Zionism has become, lately, anti-Zionism in the eyes of many Americans and American Jews. And in talks in my home country, and also his friends and my son-in-law, who has been born in Jerusalem, he said a few weeks ago to me, Fons, Israel is lost. It has lost its vocation. And he found it extremely painful to utter this statement, because there was so much poetry in his use. And it is also the idea of Simone Bitton, who directed the movie Le Mur, that Israel has become a ghetto. And you yourself write about Israel as an offshore satellite of the US. And could you comment a little bit about this very difficult but extremely important topic?
Mm-hmm. Well, you're right that I grew up as a Zionist. I was a Zionist youth leader in the 40s and so on. And now many people would consider me an anti-Zionist, but I haven't changed. Zionism has changed. I have pretty much the same views I had then. So in those days, say when I was a Zionist youth leader in the 1940s, I happened to be opposed to a Jewish state. I don't think that there should be Christian states or Islamic states or Jewish states. I don't think there should be states, but that's another question. But if there are, they should be the states of the citizens. But that was considered Zionism in those days. In fact, I was in favor of. I was part of the. I was an active member of the part of the Zionist movement, which not only opposed the Jewish state, but wanted a society based on Arab-Jewish working-class cooperation, which I don't think was an idle dream. Now people mock it, but I don't think it was an idle dream in the circumstances of those days. Furthermore, there was a brief period when it was possible, I think, to go back to something like this conception of Zionism, namely from 1967 to 1975, roughly. And during that period, an enlightened Israeli leadership could have moved towards, first of all, peaceful settlement with the major Arab states. That was easily possible, almost easily documented, but also internally to some kind of federalism internally. That is, turning the territories that they occupied after 1967 into a Palestinian and a Jewish, primarily Palestinian entities, which could be in some federal arrangement, gradually moving towards closer integration of the societies as hostilities declined, relationships developed on other than ethnic lines, and so on. I think that was entirely feasible. In fact, there were even proposals within Israeli military intelligence to do something sort of like that. They decided to abandon the opportunity. By 1975, when Palestinian nationalism sort of entered the international agenda, those opportunities were lost. However, they still remain in the long term. And I think it would be a much more healthy outcome for both societies. So as what's called Zionism changed, what I continue to believe in has shifted from being Zionism to anti-Zionism, but that's terminology. What Zionism has become, and what your friend was talking about, is a form of state worship. It's, in fact, in the United States, but also in Europe, it's reminiscent of some of the ugliest days of Stalinism. We support the state, no matter what its crimes, no matter what its violence. We denounce critics of state violence as being, anti-Semites or some appellation or other. All of this is quite reminiscent of Stalinist practice. I think it's very bad for Israel. I think it's, in fact, my own view since the 70s, I've written it many times, is that the people who call themselves supporters of Israel are in reality supporters of its moral degeneration and probably ultimate destruction. There were specific decisions made. You can identify them right along the way, which have led to the consequence that Israel is now pretty much an offshore vassal satellite of the United States, even beginning to resemble it in its internal construction. Israel used to be a sort of a social democratic, Scandinavian-style society. Well, that's changed enormously. Has some of the highest inequality in the world. The social services have collapsed. It's become a kind of caricature of some of the worst aspects of the United States. And those are choices. Didn't have to happen.
Partly in opposition to what you are saying, there were in 1950 two laws accepted. One on the right of return for all the Jews worldwide, and the other one, much less known, the so-called law of the absentees. That's to say, the Palestinians who were expelled, had gone in exile, and so on. And that law determined the right of the Israeli government to expropriate their land and their houses. including the fact that they were not allowed to return in, and also not their children. And so right now in those days there were 80,000 Palestinians who were expelled and fled away.
800,000. 800,000. 100,000.
Before 1950?
700,000 or 800,000.
Before 1950?
Yeah, I thought it was.
Well, and now the number is about 4 million.
Yeah.
But so these two laws, which are so to say each other's corollary, are in fact already indicating that Israel would not be a binational state, because the two laws were preventing that solution which you always have defended.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. First of all, I think the most significant, internal to Israel, the most significant discriminatory laws against the remaining Palestinian population are hidden in a complex mixture of legal decisions, bureaucratic arrangements, administrative decisions, and so on. But they are designed to ensure that non-Jewish citizens of Israel do not have access to over 90% of the land of the country. Now, there's no law that says that in those words, but if you look at the combination of law, administrative practice, contracts with the Jewish National Fund and so on, it's exactly the way it comes out. You have to decode a lot of pull apart a lot of complex threads to find it, but it's there. And I've written about it extensively. There's a detailed literature on it. That's a really serious discrimination. Now, it's interesting that 7 years ago, 2000, the High Court in Israel did finally rule that those laws and practices were illegal in the case of one Arab trying to move into a village that was blocked from Arabs. However, that law has not been implemented. Maybe it will sooner or later. It's the beginning of a break. And we may remember, as I said, that the 14th Amendment in the United States, it took a century before it was even formally implemented. Things like that are very serious. Even the right of return, it's intriguing to see how it works. So the right of return, law of the right of return says Jews are permitted to return to Israel, but non-Jews are permitted to return too if the rabbis decide to designate them to be Jews. So it's not a trivial fact. If you look at the Russian immigration to Israel, a very high proportion of the Russians who came do not qualify as Jews under Jewish law. They were brought in for racist reasons. They're blonde, they're blue-eyed, they're white, and so on, and they're educated. A lot of Israeli high-tech comes from them. So it sort of protects Israel from a process which has been called Levantinization, becoming too much like the bad people there. That's one of the reasons why the so-called Oriental Jews, the Jews in the Arab countries, have also been very sharply discriminated against, in some ways worse than Israeli Arabs. Actually, I've seen it, some amazing examples just personally. This is slowly changing, but pretty slowly. So there are all kinds of things happening inside. However, the move towards some form of integration with the Palestinians, Palestinian Arabs, right now, since the chances of federalism in the early 70s have been lost, is a prospect. It could be achieved first by if the United States and Israel would abandon their rejectionism. They have for 30 years unilaterally rejected the international consensus on a two-state settlement. But if they abandon that and accept what the international consensus has been, and it's pretty clear, a two-state settlement on the international border with minor and mutual modifications and various adjustments on Jerusalem and so on, which technical ones, which are pretty clear. If the U.S. and Israel would accept that, then that could be the first step in moves towards closer integration, perhaps some kind of federalism, maybe broader than even Cisjordan. And who knows, maybe a preference on the part of the populations for closer integration as circumstances permit. I mean, anyone who knows that area, who's traveled around Cisjordan, the region from Jordan to the sea, knows perfectly well that drawing a line through it anywhere doesn't make a lot of sense for the people involved. It should be an integrated area, and over time, maybe that will happen.
Another difficult question, 9/11. And many people consider that as a kind of unique event, a kind of the beginning of a new era. But you could also say that the attack fits into a pattern of resistance against the Western world that stems from decades, or in fact is a prolongation of the anti-colonial struggles from the past century. So my question to you is, how do you view this event as something really unique, or as something that fits into a more global pattern of struggles between partly the former colonies and the Western world, especially the United States?
Well, it was unique in one critical sense. A Western power was attacked. Keep to the United States. 9/11 was the first time that the U.S. national territory had been attacked since the British burned Washington in 1814. The guns had always been pointed in the other direction. Need not run over the history. But here, the United States was not the attacker, it was attacked with a criminal attack. The reaction over the world was outrage at the crime, sympathy with the victims, but then something else. Welcome to the club. What you're now suffering is a small part of what you've done to us for years. In fact, let's be specific about it. 9/11 was horrible enough, but it could have been worse. Let's imagine the following. Imagine that Al-Qaeda had bombed Washington, had bombed the White House, killed the president, instituted a military coup, established a vicious dictatorship, which killed 50 to 100,000 people and tortured 700,000, set up a massive international terrorist center, which carried out assassinations throughout the world, helped establish neo-Nazi-style states in the region, and so on. Suppose it had brought in a group of economists, call them the Kandahar boys, who drove the economy into maybe the worst economic disaster of its history. I suppose all that happened. Well, actually, that did happen. I'm not making it up. That happened on what is usually called the first 9/11 in Latin America, namely September 11th, 1973. It happened in Chile. The only thing I've changed is per capita equivalence, which is the right sort of comparison. Well, we don't pay much attention to that. But that was exactly the U.S.-backed, maybe instigated, Pinochet coup in Chile. That's what I've described as just what happened. And that's by no means the worst atrocity that the West has carried out in the rest of the world. So yes, what we call 9/11 was a unique event because of the way the guns were pointed. Hideous crime, undoubtedly. But if we want to understand it honestly, we have to extricate ourselves from the deeply rooted imperial mentality, which makes a sharp distinction between the crimes we carry out against others, which are okay, and the crimes they carry out against us, which are unspeakable. So sure, it changed history in that respect. And if you look at its effect on the U.S. population, it's kind of interesting. It opened people's minds. It made them raise questions. It's a very insular society. Most people probably don't know where the Netherlands are, but it's not a joke. And but this made people think, look, we better know something about the world. I mean, why do people out there hate us? We're so nice and wonderful. And the effect was quite striking.
Mr. Chomsky, you are, as I saw at the internet recently, praised by Bin Laden as a wise man because you understand the political situation. You also met Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, in Beirut after the war in Lebanon in 2006. And also Hugo Chavez of Venezuela has praised you publicly. And if I'm not mistaken, you held in September 2006 a lecture in the UN, the United Nations. Well, that leads me to probably a weird question in your eyes. Would you ever consider to mediate between the parties involved in the war on terror if being asked?
Well, it's kind of interesting. You're asking a very common question, and it's very interesting. The question is interesting. I don't want to be impolite, but the question itself is an interesting reflection of Western imperial mentality. So let's take those cases apart. What Bin Laden said was that George Bush should have followed my advice not to invade Iraq. Not a very surprising comment. I think you'd get high agreement on that all over the world. Bin Laden didn't just mention me. He mentioned others much more prominently. If Osama bin Laden mentions a super hawk who wants to annihilate everyone, well, that's just fine. But if he mentions a dissident, somehow a big problem. Let's take Nasrallah. Yes, I visited Nasrallah. I was in Lebanon giving lectures, and when I'm in a country, I like to find out as much as I can about the range of opinions and attitudes and popular movements and so on. Hezbollah is a substantial part of the Lebanese political system, along with its close ally Amal that represents pretty much the Shiite population. Together with its other ally, Michel Aoun, may well represent a majority. So sure, I was quite interested in meeting Nasrallah. And that's a big incident in the West. However, on the same trip, I spent a lot more time with the leading opponent of Hezbollah, namely Walid Jumblat, Druz leader, who invited me and my wife and companions to his home up in the Druz mountains in Muhtara. Dinner there, extensive discussions. That's not an issue. What's an issue is if you meet someone who's an official enemy of the West. That becomes a big issue. When you meet someone who's a friend of the West, well, not an issue. Hugo Chavez showed that book in a press conference. Okay, it's fine. What does it matter? We should ask ourselves why things are presented the way they are. Okay, and we learn a lot about ourselves that way. Now, would I mediate in the so-called war on terror? They don't need my mediation. The war on terror, there are, first of all, we should ask what the war on terror is. Point number one, George Bush didn't declare the war on terror on September 11th, 2001. He redeclared it. The war on terror was declared by Ronald Reagan 20 years earlier when he came into office and announced that The struggle against international terrorism would be the focus of U.S. foreign policy. It was a major terrorist war. Reagan's war on terror, it killed a couple 100,000 people in Central America, practically destroyed 4 countries, supported South African terror in Mozambique and Angola that may have killed 1.5 million people, and on and on. That was the war on terror. That was the first one. And what has the second war on terror done? Well, one of the things it's done is increase terror substantially, and as anticipated. So take, say, the invasion of Iraq. It was expected by intelligence agencies that it would probably lead to increased terror. Well, it did, but far beyond what was anticipated. So the latest study by 2 Western U.S. terrorism specialists calculates what they call the Iraq effect, the effect of the Iraq war on terror, as yielding a 7-fold increase of terror. That's pretty substantial. One way to reduce terror, which is rarely discussed, is very simple. Stop participating in it. That's a simple way to reduce terror. And in fact, that would reduce it quite considerably. But we're not supposed to talk about that because our terror is not terror. It's, liberation or something. But one way to reduce terror is stop participating in it, stop supporting it. If people commit crimes, they should be identified. There should be efforts to identify them, find out who they are, apprehend them. If it's an international crime, that would involve international cooperation, and bring them to justice. Even inside the jihadi movement, there was the immediate reaction to 9/11 was very harsh criticism of bin Laden for carrying out un-Islamic acts and for involvement in crime and so on and so forth. But thanks to George Bush, that reversed. The invasion of Afghanistan led to, and of course later Iraq, led to reversal of those attitudes and an increase of support for terrorist activities. Now, let's take the invasion. Did it have to be that way? Take the invasion of Afghanistan, which in Western ideology is considered, perfect war, nothing to say about it. It's very far from that. The invasion of Afghanistan was undertaken with the expectation that it might lead to driving literally millions of people over the edge of starvation. That was understood by the aid agencies, by the U.S. government, by academic scholarship, and so on. That's pretty serious, to undertake actions which carry a significant risk of driving millions of people, the estimates were 2.5 million, into death by starvation. Not trivial. But why was Afghanistan attacked? Well, there's an official reason. George Bush gave it the day he announced the attack. The reason was that the Taliban had refused to hand over to the U.S. people who the United States suspected of terrorism. Now, the Taliban had in fact made moves, which may or may not have been real, they asked for evidence, and they indicated they might consider extradition if evidence were presented. Well, we don't know if they would have, but no evidence was presented. In fact, that was dismissed with contempt. Is that the way to respond? Why was no evidence presented? Well, we know. 8 months later, the head of the FBI informed the press that after the biggest, most intensive investigation in history, they had no evidence. Well, I don't have to talk about Iraq, I suppose. But actions like those, instead of acts to apprehend criminals and subject them to justice, have had precisely the effect of inflaming terrorism. It's not a war on terror.
Mr. Chomsky, could you say in a few sentences something about what you call those basic innate structure of the human mind? Because I feel that it is in every aspect crucial for whatever you are doing for your linguistics, but also for your political commitment and your struggle for more morality.
Well, First of all, there is what's called a debate about whether the capacity for language is innate, but it's a one-sided debate. There are people who condemn the hypothesis, but there's nobody who defends it. The reason is it's a truism. There's nothing to defend. So they say, take my granddaughter, let's say. She was, when she was born, there was a certain environment around her. She reflexively picked out of the environment some aspects which are language related, and almost reflexively acquired the kind of competence that you and I are now exercising. Now let's take her pet kitten, or chimpanzee, or songbird, or whatever, who had exactly the same environment, but couldn't even take the first step. Okay, now there are two possibilities here. One is it's a miracle. The other possibility is she has some genetic capacity that they lack. Just as she couldn't pick up the bee's capacity to navigate. And we take for granted that's because there's some genetic capacity. Well, if there's a genetic capacity that yields the ability to acquire language, okay, the core elements of language are innate. There's no hypothesis to defend other than the hypothesis that things aren't miracles. And the same questions would arise, same kinds of questions about all other capacities, including the ones we were talking about earlier, capacities for moral judgment. They're going to develop the same way, from some combination of genetic endowment, which fixes the general framework in which they'll develop, some form of experience, which will pick one or another of the possible systems, and some ways in which laws of nature, say laws about how computation functions, efficient computation, how that enters into it. Now, these are non-trivial scientific questions, but in principle you know how to address them.
Could it be that, to conclude in a debate between you and Michel Foucault, which got the title Human Nature and subtitle Justice versus Power, and it was really very intense at that moment, and that the values you were defending and he was denying, from his point of view, had as a root cause that he still believed that the human mind during birth, conception and birth, is totally empty. He believes in that radical behavioristic point of view of the empty mind, and therefore for him follows that whatever we do and think has been conditioned by education and so on, circumstances, class, etc.
Well, we have to distinguish two issues which you mentioned. One is the belief that the human mind is empty. It could be anything could develop. That's pure mysticism. If the human mind is empty, nothing can develop. And we're left with the question, well, what is intrinsic human nature? You can't deny its existence coherently, any more you can deny a bee's inherent nature coherently. So we're left solely with the question what it is. Are elements like sympathy and compassion fundamental components of human nature or not? And that's a matter of inquiry. People like, say, Adam Smith and David Hume and others took for granted that sympathy and solidarity are basic components of human nature. The 18th century Enlightenment, the Romantic period, von Humboldt and others assumed that a need for creative work under your own control is a fundamental property of human nature. We can investigate whether that's true, but we can't investigate the question of the claim that there is no human nature because it's incoherent. So we can ask, well, what exactly is human nature like? And that's a serious topic of inquiry, both from evidence from history, from experience, even by now experimentation.
Well, Mr. Chomsky, thank you so much. And we know that it is your birthday today, and therefore I wanted to bring you a quite personal present.
Oh, okay.
On a journey in Japan a few months ago, I wrote some haikus.
You wrote?
Yes.
Ah.
Put them into 13 quartets and define the rules of the game.
Okay.
You will win how more haikus you are able to quote from your memory.
Oh, okay. So I'll practice. If we have another interview 35 years from now, you can check.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, good to see you.